today I wanted to go over some things. So you'll see that this is the same app that we were using before, the Airbnb demo. I went ahead and just kind of skipped a few things, and then I'm going to show you what I did when I skipped, and just kind of like the technologies that I chose, and give you the reasoning for that. And then what we can do is just do like some CI/CD stuff today. So these are just like buzzwords that people use. I'll show you what I mean by that. So the other day I added Material UI core and Material UI icons. So these I think I showed this maybe really briefly, but Material UI is just one of the many component frameworks that exist for React. So typically you can build everything using just like components that you custom write. So you can do different buttons and stuff and just say like button, excuse me, hello. And that is completely fine. So you'll see right there, that button that I just added, hello, just got added to the DOM. The unfortunate part about that is it looks bad. It looks like OG internet, right? Like this is just unstyled. This is what the browser looks like when you render a button. So a lot of these libraries have taken those base components and they build on top of them and say, this is what a button should look like. So Material UI is one of them. It's created, like the specs are created by Google. So Google said, here's how Material UI, here's how like our UIs look, and it became super popular because Google. Everybody just loves Google. So this is Material Design. You can kind of look at like what they say. So they have their own just ways of displaying common elements in a UI.
Would you call this a library?
So this is more like a framework.
Okay.
Like the UI framework. They created this whole like design system called Material UI. But this itself is like a framework, probably. Maybe a library. I don't know. It's all the same. Everybody uses these terms interchangeably. But yeah, they kind of define like, here's what it should be, and essentially all Material UI is just like, what does paper look like? And then translating that into what that would look like on a screen.
Isn't it kind of more like, it's kind of like a set of rules you're following, really?
Yeah, exactly. And it's very like paper focused and like physical focused. So that's why you'll always see like the Gmail, let's see, you'll see it here, it's kind of a crappy. But every logo that Google has, they're kind of physical. You can see shadows and like the depth, yeah, exactly. So they very much adhere to this principle in all their logos and like everything that they do. They really like shadows and the idea of depth
to
the page. So people like that. People like depth. It looks nice. So you'll see it like in a lot of projects, a lot of different like you can see here. There's a little bit of shadow here underneath. Barely, you can see that.
Yeah.
But, so typically, like elements have shadow and all these different things. So you can see here, box shadow. That's typically used. Do you see that shadow disappearing and appearing? So that's essentially, this is where the shadow is defined for the paper. So this is supposed to be like a layer of paper on top of a base layer of paper, basically.
Does rendering like UI elements like cause performance issues though, or?
Not really anymore. Like you can imagine probably on like lower end Android phones it would, but now computers are so fast it doesn't really matter. It used to be a thing, yeah. Kind of like, I don't know what was first, but computers evolved, right? And then UIs also evolved to become more and more complex. And now you don't really have to think about it unless you're doing something like a really long list of something, or like these large, very, very large things you're trying to render. But anyway, so this is what like buttons look like by default when your browser renders them. And so if I change this to be the button component from Material UI, which I just imported, let's see, maybe I didn't import that.
We haven't done it yet. You want to make sure you're doing it in the directory though for Airbnb.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm waiting.
So it just changed to use the Material UI version, which happens to be just like this base text thing. So now you have this like click ripple effect that happens. They add all these things on top of what a button is defined by in like the Material UI docs. So I'll kind of show you what that looks like just to give you a little sense of whatever this is. Let's see. So you can always go into these libraries and just look at how they implement stuff. You see it's just a ton of styling. That's basically all these libraries are, just like a ton of styling. When you do this, it looks like this kind of thing. So you'll see in the end, so all these like on-click handlers, it does that ripple effect that you're seeing. That's basically they layer all that stuff on top of it, and then like these key handlers and stuff. What I'm really looking for is button, but I'm guessing that's like, where you at? Anyway, either way, this is how they're all implemented. So you can kind of see whenever you're like, oh, what is actually happening under the hood here. You're essentially using the button component, which is defined in this library here, which then just has a ton of styling layer on top of it to make it look nice. So if you don't want to write all this styling for your own components, then you use a library. That's pretty much the reasoning why everybody uses libraries, is because you don't really, like if you're building something, you usually don't want to spend a lot of time on making a button look nice.
Yeah.
Like you want to get past that point. You want to actually build the thing that you're building, right? And then usually when companies become large enough, then they're like, okay, we want our own styling, like we want to break away from what Material UI looks like and define our own like design.
Do they have like, because I think I remember the last presentation from that woman.
Yeah.
She said there's like a hierarchy of like, you see there's like a bold typeface and like a more gray typeface.
Yeah.
Do they separate those in Material UI? Like they have different categories for that?
So they say it's like,
Sure they do.
yeah, they definitely do, and it's very like HTML based. So it's like H1, H2, you know, header 1, header 2 kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's how they split them. They have these like custom components. So in code, it looks like this: typography variant H1, variant H2. So it's just like a variant of that typography component. So that's usually how you like trigger these. There's a lot of other libraries out there. So Ant Design is one of them. This is a super popular one. I guess they claim to be.
Themselves the second.
I know.
The second most popular. So
Cool.
What's the first?
That would be Material UI.
Really?
It's like super self-aware.
I love that.
Yeah, Material UI is definitely the first popular. It's
cool
hilarious
way
to
to
claim
put
the
it.
second
That's
most popular. We're almost there. But yeah, they do the same thing. So you can see like the way they do buttons is different. It doesn't do like a ripple effect kind of thing, but there's just different ways of doing it.
I kind of like this one better.
So I'd recommend when you guys start projects, just do research into these different libraries. There's a ton of them. So
What's like the material.io versus like Material UI website?
one's from Google, and one is the library that like implements what
Gotcha.
Google puts out. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so you can kind of see here, there's like UI frameworks, and then there's a bunch of them. So usually when you start a new project, you just kind of choose one of these and start using it. Ant Design is Chinese, which means that the docs kind of suck sometimes because they're very much like English English is not their first language.
Yeah, you're just
So it's
translating.
sometimes hard to understand. There's another one that's like very data driven. I forget what the name is, but there's basically what I'm trying to say is Material UI is not the one you need to use. It's just the one I'll recommend if you don't have like a preference. But there's a lot of other choices out there. Usually when you're starting a project, you just kind of decide what's the style I want to look like, and then you choose one of these. Semantic UI is another one that I've used in the past, which looks really nice. It's kind of like a different style, you know, you can just kind of feel what they look like. Yeah.
Is one like easier to work with than another? Or?
They all have their pluses and minuses. Like,
Yeah.
Semantic UI, they're all pretty much the same.
Okay.
They all pretty much look like this. There's different ways of like doing variants on these things, sizing and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, they're all pretty good. There's really no, like I've switched between a lot of these and they're all pretty much the same. But again, you just kind of choose one and eventually you get indebted enough to that library where it's
Yeah.
really hard to switch.
Yeah, so if you wanted to, like you built out the entire website and Material, and then you wanted to switch, like
Yeah.
how would you do that?
You could just replace all the, like every button, you just
It's gonna
replace with
take
a
a while,
Semantic
yeah.
UI button.
Really?
You'd have to, a lot of times things just come down to building things so they change for mobile versus, so you see like how that top bar changes at a certain breakpoint. Breakpoint is like what people use to describe like the way that UI has changed. So you see that like 1,010, 1,013 is their breakpoint there, where the
Yeah.
UI changes to look like something different. And I'm sure it changes again. Yeah, it changed there again. This is like now tablet level getting to mobile level. So you will do the same thing. This is what I do a lot. You just like responsive view, drag in, see how it looks at different widths, and make sure that it doesn't look like crap on a mobile screen or tablet or something. So I'm sure some engineers done the same thing at GitHub. Just taken this and dragged it. Gone like, oh, that looks pretty nice, cool. All right, transitions well. Until you get to
Before.
What is
pixels and that looks
Apple
like
Watch
crap.
or something?
Don't forget you can view every website on an Apple Watch. How are you accounting for that screen size?
Yeah, I don't know if people are doing that, but
I like to test it sometimes.
Yeah.
does anybody have any questions on that, like UI libraries and stuff?
Have you ever used Letho?
Oh, it's Android. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are all like React focused, but I'm sure there's others for.
When it comes to like testing the like responsive stuff, like, is it still like, even though you can like test dragging there, doesn't it still come down to you just need to see it on like an actual mobile screen sometimes, right? Because I feel like sometimes you see things pop up that you wouldn't.
Yeah, that is a good point, but usually like the way things are rendered is kind of universal.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. Like per browser is a different thing. Like Firefox will render things differently.
Yeah.
Safari is another one. So usually you should have like a few browsers on your computer.
Yeah.
That's another thing. These libraries handle, like the Material UI, they handle the difference between Firefox and Chrome and Edge and all these. They usually have like styling in place for the weird edge cases that happen on each of those. Let's see if I can find an example of that. Yeah, so you'll see here like Moz, that's Mozilla, that's Firefox. WebKit appearance, that's usually Chrome. WebKit is usually Chrome. So you'll see like these things, you'd have to write custom and figure out like, oh, Mozilla just craps itself when this certain thing happens. And so they did that, and they wrote that into the library because somebody experienced that issue. So yeah, Moz, OSX font smoothing.
So if you didn't have this library, you would need to do all this yourself?
You wouldn't need to. Like, usually those things are pretty edge case. If you're just using a button, it'll probably work.
Okay.
But if you start doing fancy things like doing this ripple effect and stuff, that's usually when browsers start behaving strangely.
Okay.
this is just why, like, all these things, you don't want to spend time on this, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're doing this as your job, you don't want to spend time on it. So
Right.
like, just use a library and call it a day, because it
Yeah.
does all these things for you. But it's good to know, like, these things are happening in the background.
Mhm.
These different, like, styles are getting applied for each browser. It kind of gets rid of the whole, like, it doesn't work on my browser but works on yours kind of thing. Cool. So today I'm going to go over GitHub Actions. So I'll kind of show you that this exists in GitHub. It's actually really new. It's only like in the past few months they added this. But it's basically a way of doing CI/CD. So has anybody done like CI/CD before or know what that is?
I keep forgetting. Yeah, I think it's supposed to.
Yeah. So it's a very like generic term that people kind of just throw around a lot to sound smart. But it is like, it's what you say in industry. But so CI/CD, basically, like I showed you before, you know, you have different code, right? Maybe like you're committing something and then merging it back into master branch. So let's say this is like the master branch. This is some dev branch. So usually developers are pushing to these. You started working on some changes here and then got to merge back into master here. So every time you push code to one of these places, you have the ability to run like a CI/CD pipeline. So running like different commands, like maybe you want to build the code, and then maybe you want to test the code, and then maybe you want to deploy it somewhere. So I'll kind of show you what that looks like, but that's the general gist of things. Is every time you push something to the repo, something will detect that change and run code against those the changes that you made. So I'll kind of show you what I do for the personal project that I have, because it's probably the best example, and then we can copy that over into. So you can see here GitHub workflows. So this is where they live for the GitHub Actions. So this is essentially checking out the code. It's using a certain version of Node, which is just the 12.x version. And then it's doing yarn install. It's deploying it to now here, and then it's running integration tests against those changes that were just deployed. That's basically what it is. There's a whole lot of weird stuff here, but so I want to do the same thing. Like I want to add a GitHub workflow, and I want you guys to try to follow along if you'd like.
On our own project?
Yeah, on your own project or whichever one you want, really. But we'll add a GitHub workflow definition here. So let's see. That's probably a very easy way of doing it. So I'm just going to create this directory first. Alright, so I just created that directory. Say I'm just going to copy and paste some stuff. So just create this directory here as .github/workflows, and then some name in there, whatever you want to call it. You're probably going to be running a build and then doing like a test. That's usually where you start with things. So
Yeah, I don't know what. It's a YML file.
yeah, so YML is YAML,
Oh.
yet another markup language. Is what that stands for. Yeah. So there's a lot. Like, I think you can probably do this the same way in JSON. YAML is just it's formatted like this. It's kind of confusing, but it's very like Python-y, where it's very focused on like indentation being correct. So like indentation has to be correct, and there's certain ways of doing things. But YAML's pretty common.
Where did you get that in unit 10?
I just copied it from somewhere, just from my personal project. So let me just send it to the channel here.
Yeah, because they have an example one here, but it's just like prints hello world or something.
Okay. So along the same lines, it looks for, it only runs on pull requests. This is just a fancy way of saying run on node 12. And then it just runs these steps here. So it checks out the code from Git. Then it basically just installs node. And then it runs these commands: yarn install, yarn lint, yarn build, and yarn test. So, yeah, you can see the folder here if you got lost there. So GitHub will just automatically look for this folder and then run stuff against it. So on this note, I'll just kind of go on a quick tangent here because it's valuable. So YAML files are super common. It's a good thing to know. Just like mess around with the YAML files. You'll probably need to at some point. This is JSON. You can convert from the two. They're pretty much the same. They're both like kind of markdown languages. So you see that same structure.
Oh yeah.
You know, like JSON's really easy to understand because there's so many characters there. You know that these brackets mean that it's part of this like smaller thing, right? It just kind of makes sense. It's very like Java-y. But YAML's not. It's almost more like Python, where you have a lot of indentation and you have to like make sure. But anyway, that's what this looks like. So you can kind of see like the nested stuff is indented and stuff like that. So usually, like, if you're really having trouble with the YAML and you're really confused as to what it should look like, doing one of these is JSON to YAML or YAML to JSON usually helps a lot because it just like helps you like conceptualize things a little easier. Like if you were trying to figure out how to write something, you just write it in JSON and then convert it to YAML, call it a day. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to add just these tools here. So there's no linting installed. There's no like lint command here. There's a build. There's no test. So I'm going to add both of those scripts to this, which is kind of a bigger question because I don't remember how to do linting on here, but we're going to figure it out. All right. So, yeah. So TS-lint, I'm just going to throw a lot of tools at you. TS-lint is basically a way of formatting. So a linter, does anybody know what a linter is? Worked with it before? Maybe like super confused and like, why are you saying linter? Yeah. So basically what a linter does is it looks at your code, it tells you if it's formatted correctly, if it's formatted to these certain criteria that need to be met. So it usually prevents dumb errors that you introduce in the code just because you're doing something silly. Like maybe you do a const number.
A semicolon could be.
Yeah, semicolon's one.
Included.
Like, well, actually, that's kind of like more of a TypeScript thing, but yeah, semicolon's one of them. So if you start just making the code base look real ugly like this, and you just start, I don't know, making things look bad, you can essentially do linting to do that. to enforce rules like that.
So it's like a workflow thing.
It's like a workflow thing, yeah.
Yeah, what is the deal with semicolons in TypeScript and JavaScript? Because you don't need them technically, right?
Yeah, you don't need them. People have preferences. Some people actually don't like semicolons.
Yeah.
I've worked at code bases like that, and it actually is kind of confusing because you don't really know where a line ends.
Yeah,
Where it's supposed to end. So I prefer semicolons. Really, the only reason you need semicolons is if you do something like this, which you don't see very often.
Right, where you're running multiple things in one line. Isn't really
the same line.
Why did they make it optional in the first place is my question.
Yeah.
Well,
That's a good question.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I
like
don't
there
know.
isn't even variable types in JavaScript. So like,
Yeah,
that's
JavaScript
what-
is a pretty loose language in general. Some languages, yeah, would require those termination characters like that. But anyway, all right. DSLint. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing I usually do because this is just the be-all, end-all. Oh no. I don't know if they have an example here.
correct?
Alright. So this is typically a dev dependency. The reason why I changed that is because it's a dev dependency. That means it doesn't really go into the code base in the end and like serve the web page at all. It's just this like developer thing that exists to help like lint your code essentially.
So what do you run?
Yarn add tslint -- dev.
Yeah. Add tslint -- dev. Yeah. So that'll add tslint as a dependency. Let's see. So I'm just going to copy this command from here just because it makes it a little easier, and then I'll show you.
Uppercase.
So you can see this command here, tslint. I think it's just
Didn't
setting a
update mine.
directory. And then this tells it to use a certain tslint.json, which I'm going to get rid of.
Have you used ESLint?
Yeah, so that's typically, since we're using TypeScript, ESLint's usually for like JavaScript.
Okay.
Yeah. So that command here.
Also, if we're not using TypeScript, we should use ESLint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it just supposed to update your
Use
dependencies
imagine,
automatically?
yeah. Here I was just following along with what we're doing with this project.
Yeah, when you run that yarn add,
It says done, but I don't see any new dependencies here.
you might not be in the right directory again. Is that the case?
Wait, Chase, can you explain why something would be in dev dependencies versus dependencies again?
Yeah. So
I'm in workflows.
draw it out here too. So usually you have like stuff that makes your code built into that HTML, CSS, JS, right? Like you have this bundle that gets deployed to some web server, and then every time like there's a user that's hitting that, it gets served these things, right? But before this, there's a bunch of ways to convert the code that you're working with, like all the React code, into HTML, CSS, and JS, right? Like you want these compiled versions of things. So something like Webpack would be a dev dependency. I remember I touched on Webpack a little bit before. So Webpack essentially would take these things, it would like do a lot of minification and changing the way that the files interact, and it would turn them into this HTML, CSS, JS. They end up getting pushed to some server and then deployed to a computer. So dev dependencies are typically like not necessarily things that live in that HTML, CSS, or JS in the end. They're the stuff that gets you to that compiled state. Does that make sense? So that's why like TypeScript doesn't live in that end bundle. None of these like types do.
Because ultimately it becomes JavaScript for.
Yeah, because ultimately it becomes JavaScript. Because the browser can't interpret what TypeScript is. It doesn't know what TypeScript is.
So would it break
TypeScript is just like invented for developers.
So would it break your project if you like have Webpack in dependencies, not dev dependencies?
No, it doesn't.
It's just an organization.
It's just an organization thing. Yeah, you'll just like piss people off if you see it or something. I don't know. There's really there's no downside to that. But you can do like npm install dev dependencies. There's a way to install like only these, and it's like npm install production or something.